We talk about a major business deal. There is this, I mean, there's an ingrained expectation of like mechanical precision.
Right, like engineering.
Exactly, like engineering. You negotiate, you print out this massive stack of papers, you sign on the dotted line, the ink dries, and the lawyer points to the binder and says, there it is. That is the agreement.
Yeah.
It's totally tangible.
Yeah. It's comforting to think of it as binary, like a switch that is either flipped off or, flipped on.
Right. Signed or not signed. It feels clean.
Yeah.
But then you take that comforting binary assumption and you step into the world of the Philippine Civil Code, specifically the law on contracts.
Yeah.
And suddenly that legal x-ray machine you thought you were using is just completely broken.
Oh, absolutely. Broken into pieces.
Yeah. We are looking at a landscape that is incredibly murky. I mean, is a nod across a boardroom table a contract? Is a corporate advertisement calling for suppliers a binding offer? At what exact microsecond does a massive corporate merger actually, blink into existence?
It really is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters, because the law doesn't just look at the ink on the paper. It actually attempts to look into the psychological state of the parties involved.
And today, we're going to teach you how to see through that mud. We are taking a massive slide-by-slide, really intensive deep dive into Articles 1318 to 1355 of the Civil Code of the Philippines.
The foundational stuff.
Exactly. We've pulled together the contract law blueprint, official CPO review materials, and the latest regulatory framework for business transactions, or, the RFPT syllabus. Our rub is singular here. We want to extract the exact legal nuances, the infamous board traps, and the foundational logic you really need to master the essential requisites of contracts.
Which is so crucial.
Yeah, so whether you are staring down the barrel of the CPA licensure examination, or you're just a business professional trying to understand the invisible scaffolding that holds your deals together, you're in the right place.
And we should probably establish right away that mastering these articles is not about, rote memorization. Oh, no. Please don't memorize.
Right. Memorizing 37 distinct legal articles will only leave you completely overwhelmed. This is really about understanding the why behind the rules. If you understand the underlying, architectural philosophy of a contract, the rules simply become logical.
They make sense?
Exactly. They become inevitable extensions of that structure. You won't have to memorize 100 different exam scenarios if you truly grasp the core principles.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start at the absolute beginning, the blueprint. Before we can talk about how a contract fractures or how a court annuls a multi-million peso acquisition, we need to know what a contract actually is, in the eyes of the law.
Well, for that foundational definition, we look to Article 1305 of the Civil Code. It states, a contract is a meeting of minds between two persons, whereby one binds himself, with respect to the other, to give something or to render some service.
A meeting of minds. I've always found that phrase so striking. I mean, it sounds almost poetic, mystical even.
It does have a certain ring to it. But in a legal commercial sense, the threshold for that meeting is incredibly strict, isn't it?
Oh, extremely strict. It means both parties are looking at the exact same subject matter, understanding the exact same terms, and agreeing to the exact same consequences.
So no gray areas.
No, none. It is a perfect psychological alignment regarding a legal obligation. Like, if you are sitting across from me and you think you are licensing my company's software for a limited 5-year term,
Okay.
but I believe I'm selling you the software outright in exchange for a percentage of your gross revenue, well, our minds have not met.
Wow. Even if we shook hands.
Even if we smiled, shook hands, and signed a preliminary document, legally, the foundational element is fractured. The contract just does not exist.
Okay, now that definition also uses the phrase between two persons. Let's stress test that in a corporate environment. Because, can I make a contract with myself?
With your...
Yeah. For instance, let's say I am the CEO and majority shareholder of Company A, but I also own a private consulting firm. Can I, as the CEO of Company A, sign a highly lucrative service contract with myself as the private consultant?
Oh, what's fascinating here is the legal distinction between natural persons and juridical persons.
Right.
You, as a flesh and blood human being, are a natural person. Your corporation, Company A, is a completely separate juridical person. It's an artificial entity created by operation of law.
So they're two totally different things in the eyes of the law.
Right. So technically, you are acting in a representative capacity for the juridical person and contracting with yourself as a natural person.
So the law still sees two persons sitting at the table, even if it's literally just me switching chairs.
Precisely. The legal personalities are distinct. However, the law is acutely aware of the potential for abuse here, what we call self-dealing.
Yeah, that sounds super sketchy.
It can be. So while theoretically a contract between two distinct legal entities, corporate law heavily regulates this to ensure fiduciary duties aren't breached. But purely from the perspective of Article 1305, a minimum of two distinct legal entities must exist to form that binding relationship. You cannot, in your individual capacity, make a legally binding contract with your individual self.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, you can't sue yourself for breach of contract.
Exactly.
Now, these agreements don't just pop into existence out of the ether. They have a lifespan. They are born, they live, and eventually they die. Let's trace that life cycle, because I know exam questions love to, trick candidates on exactly where a scenario falls on this timeline.
Yeah, they really do. So the life cycle of a contract is generally divided into three distinct stages. First, you have the preparation or negotiation stage. In older texts, this is sometimes actually called generation. This encompasses all the preliminary steps leading up to the perfection of the contract.
This is the courtship phase.
It is, yeah. You are exchanging letters of intent, you are haggling over the price, conducting due diligence, inspecting the assets, sending draft agreements back and forth.
And crucially, during this generation stage, there is absolutely no definite agreement.
Right.
Like, I could spend 6 months negotiating a massive corporate buyout, spend millions on lawyers, and then just walk away the day before signing.
As a general rule under contract law, yes.
Oh, wow.
Because the contract hasn't been born yet, so there is no contractual obligation to breach. You can just walk away. Now, there are caveats regarding acting in bad faith under human relations laws, but purely in terms of the contract itself, neither party is bound.
Okay, so that brings us to the second stage.
Right. Perfection, or the birth of the contract. This is the exact specific moment the parties come to a definite agreement.
The meeting of the minds.
Exactly. The meeting of the minds actually occurs here. The ignition switch is turned.
And the final stage.
Consummation. The death or termination of the contract. This is when the parties have fully performed their respective obligations.
So everyone did what they promised.
Yeah. You delivered the fleet of vehicles, the other company transferred the funds. The contract has fulfilled its economic and legal purpose and is officially extinguished.
So generation, perfection, consummation. That brings us to the absolute cornerstone of this entire deep dive. Our sources emphasize this over and over again in bold red letters. Article 1318.
Oh, yes. Article 1318.
If you take away only one concept today, it should be the anatomy of Article 1318.
Yes. Article 1318 is really the gatekeeper. It states unequivocally that there is no contract unless three specific requisites concur. And concur is the operative word here. They must all be present simultaneously.
Right.
Those three are consent, object, and cause.
COC. Consent, object, cause. I like to picture Article 1318 as like a three-legged stool holding up a multi-million peso deal. You have the consent leg, the object leg, and the cause leg.
That's a great visual.
Right. If you have all three, you have a sturdy piece of legal architecture. You can sit on it. You can build a business on it. But if you remove even one leg, say, the object isn't legally valid or the consent was totally faked, the entire stool collapses.
It falls right over.
Yeah, the agreement falls into what the law categorizes as the void status. It is a ghost. It produces no legal effect.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the concept of void ab initio, meaning void from the very beginning. It's not a contract that went bad. It's a contract that legally never existed in the first place because the foundational architecture was never complete.
Let's test this three-legged stool with a scenario that I know trips up a lot of people on the CPA board exams. It has to do with that murky preparation stage.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's say my logistics company wants to build a new regional distribution hub. I put an advertisement in a major business newspaper looking for commercial construction firms to build a 50,000 square foot warehouse. Submit your bids by Friday.
Standard practice.
Right, so Friday rolls around and three major firms submit their proposals. Firm A bids 50 million pesos. Firm B bids 45 million, and Firm C comes in at the lowest bid of 40 million pesos.
Okay.
Have their minds and my mind met? Am I legally obligated to accept Firm C's 40 million peso bid? Has a contract been born?
This is a classic trap regarding the boundaries of the generation stage. The answer is no. A contract has not been born, and you are not obligated to accept Firm C.
Really? But I asked for bids.
You did, but according to the specific rules governing advertisements for editors, these announcements are simply invitations to make proposals. They are not definite offers.
Ah, so my newspaper ad wasn't me saying, I promise to hire whoever is cheapest. My ad was just me saying, hey, the door to the preparation stage is open. Come in and talk to me.
Exactly. When Firm C submits that 40 million peso bid, they are the ones making the legal offer. You, as the advertiser, hold the power of acceptance.
That makes total sense.
Right. The meeting of the minds hasn't happened until you explicitly say yes to a specific proposal. The advertiser is not bound to accept the highest or lowest bidder unless the advertisement specifically stated, we guarantee to award the contract to the lowest responsive bidder.
So we've established that our minds haven't met just because I asked for a quote, which perfectly transitions us into looking at exactly how the first leg of our stool, consent, is actually forged. Let's zoom in on Articles 1319 to 1346.
The law defines consent as being manifested by the meeting of the offer and the acceptance upon the thing and the cause. So to construct this first leg of the stool, you actually need two distinct materials, a valid offer from one side and a valid acceptance from the other.
But the law doesn't just let any casual comment count, right? The sources are very specific. The offer must be certain and the acceptance must be absolute. Let's break those down. What makes an offer certain in a high-stakes business context?
An offer is certain when it is definite, complete, and intentional. Let's say two CEOs are playing golf, and one says, I'd consider selling my supply chain subsidiary for around 500 million pesos, maybe sometime next quarter.
That's just thinking out loud. That's feeling out the market.
Exactly. It is a negotiation tactic, not an offer. It is too vague. An offer must be definite enough that the offeree can simply say yes, and a complete workable contract is immediately formed without needing further negotiation on essential terms.
Oh, I see.
If the CEO had sent a formal letter stating, I offer to sell you 100% of the shares of my supply chain subsidiary for exactly 500 million pesos, payable in cash within 30 days, that is a certain offer.
Because all the other side has to do is say, I accept.
Right.
Which brings us to the second half. The acceptance must be absolute. I can't just say, yes, I'll take it. What if the responding CEO writes back, I accept your offer to buy the subsidiary for 500 million pesos, but I will pay it in installments over 5 years instead of cash in 30 days.
That is what the law calls a qualified acceptance. And legally, a qualified acceptance is not an acceptance at all. It is a counteroffer.
So by saying I accept, but I haven't just tweaked their offer. I have effectively assassinated their original offer. It's dead.
Dead in the water.
And in its place, I have generated a brand new offer with the roles completely reversed.
That is the exact legal mechanism. You have become the offerer. The original offerer now has the power to accept or reject your 5-year installment plan.
Here's where it gets really interesting and where the RFBT syllabus really tries to catch candidates off guard. We are talking about this meeting of the minds, but in modern business, we rarely negotiate sitting in the same room. We use email, couriers, telegrams if we're feeling historical.
Sure.
Let's say CEO A is in Manila and sends a certified letter making that 500 million peso offer. CEO B is in Cebu. CEO B reads it, agrees completely, signs an absolute acceptance letter, and hands it to a courier to be delivered back to Manila. At the exact moment CEO B hands that letter to the courier, have the minds met? Is the contract born?
Well, if we connect this to the broader landscape of global contract law, you'll find that many Western jurisdictions, like the United States or the UK, follow what is called the manifestation theory, or the mailbox rule.
Okay.
Under that theory, the moment you manifest your acceptance, the moment you drop the letter in the mailbox or hand it to the courier, the contract is perfected. The logic is that the post office acts as the agent of the offerer.
Okay, but this is the Philippine Civil Code. We don't always do things the way the U.S. does.
We certainly do not. In the Philippines, we adhere to the cognition theory. This is one of the most critical board traps you will encounter.
The cognition theory.
Yes, Article 1319 explicitly states that acceptance made by letter or telegram does not bind the offerer until the exact moment it comes to their knowledge.
Oh, I love this distinction. I think the easiest way for anyone to visualize the cognition theory is to think about a messaging app like WhatsApp or Telegram. You receive a complex contract offer via a long text message. You type out, I absolutely accept all terms, and you hit send. Under the Western mailbox rule, the moment you hit send, the contract is born. But under the Philippine cognition theory, hitting send does nothing legally. Even if the message is delivered to their phone, you see the 2 gray ticks, it is still not a contract.
Because the offeror doesn't know about it yet.
Exactly. The offeror's phone is just sitting on their desk. They have to actually pick it up, open the app, and read your message. You need the blue ticks. The knowledge must physically enter their brain for the minds to legally meet.
That is a brilliant modern translation of the concept, the blue ticks. And you must understand why the Philippines uses the cognition theory.
Why is that?
It is based on the idea that an agreement requires a conscious concurrence of wills. How can my will concur with yours if I'm completely unaware that you have agreed? This has massive implications. What happens if, while your acceptance letter is in transit from Cebu to Manila, the CEO in Manila suffers a fatal heart attack?
Oh, wow. If they die before reading it.
Under the cognition theory, the offer is automatically extinguished by the death of the offerer. When the letter finally arrives in Manila and is opened by the CEO's estate executor, it's too late. The mind that needed to meet yours no longer exists. No contract is formed.
That is a staggering difference in legal philosophy. So we've nailed down that we need a certain offer and an absolute acceptance that actually reaches the cognition of the offer. But the law goes deeper. It doesn't just ask how you said yes, it asks who is saying yes. This brings us to the concept of capacity to consent.
Right, because the law recognizes that not every human brain is currently equipped to understand the complex, binding nature of a commercial agreement. We categorize this into absolute incapacity and relative incapacity.
Our sources list the absolutely incapacitated as unemancipated minors, insane or demented persons, and deaf mutes who do not know how to write.
The underlying legal philosophy here is protection. The state is acting as parens patriae, the parent of the nation. It presumes these specific groups cannot fully comprehend the economic and legal consequences of what they are signing, so it throws a protective shield around them.
But the way the law applies that shield creates a very specific matrix of defective contracts. Let's map this out because it's guaranteed to be on the exam. What happens if a fully capacitated 40-year-old tech CEO enters into a complex software licensing agreement with a 16-year-old coding prodigy?
If one party is incapacitated in this case, the 16-year-old minor, the contract is classified as voidable.
Voidable. Let's make sure we define that clearly. It doesn't mean the contract is trash. It means it is perfectly valid and binding right now, but it possesses an inherent flaw. It has a cracked leg.
Correct. It is valid until it is annulled by a proper action in court. Now, here is the crucial asymmetric nature of a voidable contract. Who gets to complain?
Oh, interesting. Who does?
The 16-year-old minor, upon reaching the age of majority, or their legal guardian right now, can go to court and say, I didn't have the legal capacity to agree to this, please annul it. However, the 40-year-old CEO cannot.
So the adult is trapped. The CEO can't wake up a year later, realize they made a bad deal, and say, hey, wait a minute, I signed this with a kid. The contract is void.
Exactly. The law is a shield for the vulnerable, not a sword for the capacitated party to escape a bad bargain. The adult is fully bound by their consent, pending the minor's decision to either annul the contract or ratify it once they turn 18.
Okay, but what if we change this scenario? What if that 16-year-old prodigy makes a contract with another 16-year-old prodigy to start a company? Or an insane person makes a contract with someone who is deaf-mute and cannot write?
If both parties are incapable of giving valid consent, the contract shifts into a different classification, unenforceable.
Unenforceable. How is that functionally different from voidable?
An unenforceable contract is like a computer file saved in a corrupted format.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, the agreement is in there. It's not a complete illusion like a void contract, but the court's operating system simply cannot open it or execute it. You cannot sue on an unenforceable contract.
Right.
If one 16-year-old breaches the agreement, the other 16-year-old cannot ask a judge to enforce it because the judge will look at both of them and say, neither of you had the legal standing to bring this to me in the first place.
But it's not dead forever, right? It can be fixed.
Yes, it sits in a state of legal limbo. It can be cured through a process called ratification. If the parents or guardians of both minors step in and officially approve the contract, the corruption is cleared and it becomes fully valid and enforceable. Or if both minors turn 18 and continue to honor the agreement, their actions implicitly ratify it.
That is such a clear distinction. Voidable means one capacitated person to hold accountable. Unenforceable means no capacitated persons to hold accountable. So we've established who can say yes. But what if we have two 40-year-old, perfectly sane, highly educated CEOs? They both have capacity. One says yes to the other's offer. But what if that yes was extracted through dark means? What if the consent looks absolute on paper, but internally it's tainted?
This is where we dive into the vices of consent. When the intellect or the free will of a party is compromised, the law says the consent is vitiated.
Vitiated. Tainted, corrupted, poisoned. Our sources use an acronym that every CPA candidate knows by heart, VIMFU: violence, intimidation, mistake, fraud, and undue influence.
VIMFU.
Yeah, let's spend some real time on these because the boundaries between them are where the hardest questions live. If any of these are present, the contract is voidable, valid until annulled. Let's start with a mistake, Article 1331. If I make a mistake, can I just cancel a massive corporate transaction? Let's say I acquire a logistics company, thinking their trucks are blue, but it turns out they're red. Can I void the deal?
Well, the law demands commercial stability. It will not protect you from your own trivial carelessness or lack of thoroughness in everyday business. To rise to the level of vitiating consent, the mistake must refer to the substance of the thing, which is the object of the contract, or those conditions which principally move the parties to enter into it.
So the red truck versus blue truck is a mistake of accident, not substance. I mean, a truck is still a truck. It can still haul cargo.
Correct. But let's elevate the stakes. Suppose you are acquiring a tech startup for 50 million pesos, specifically because their patent portfolio includes a revolutionary AI algorithm. That algorithm is the principal condition moving you to buy.
Okay.
After the papers are signed, you discover that due to a clerical error in the patent office, which neither you nor the startup founders realize, the specific AI algorithm isn't actually protected and is already open source.
Wow. Okay, so we both genuinely thought the patent was valid. We were both mistaken. But that mistake goes to the absolute core substance of what I was buying. I wouldn't have spent 50 million pesos for open source code.
In that scenario, the mistake is substantial. Your consent was given based on a fundamentally flawed premise. Therefore, the contract is voidable.
That's fascinating. Okay, let's move to V&I. Violence and intimidation. What is the psychological boundary the law draws between the two?
It's the difference between physical compulsion and moral coercion. Violence involves the employment of serious or irresistible physical force to compel consent. It is brute mechanics.
Like what?
Well, the classic, albeit dramatic example is someone physically grabbing your hand, wrapping your fingers around a pen, and forcing you to trace your signature onto a deed of sale. Your mind isn't even involved. Your body is being used as a tool.
So violence is, I am physically snapping your finger until you sign. What is intimidation then?
Intimidation is psychological. It occurs when one of the contracting parties is compelled by a reasonable and well-grounded fear of an imminent and grave evil upon their person, property, or on the person or property of their spouse, descendants, or ascendants to give their consent.
So intimidation is, sign this merger agreement, or I will burn down your primary manufacturing plant. My hand signs the paper willingly, but my will is completely paralyzed by fear.
Exactly. And the fear must be reasonable and imminent. A vague threat like, I'll make sure you go bankrupt someday, might not qualify. But I have someone standing outside your child's school right now certainly does.
That is terrifying. Let's bring this back into the corporate boardroom. What about undue influence? This sounds a lot like intimidation. How is it different?
Intimidation relies on an external, unlawful threat. Undue influence relies on internal leverage and the abuse of a power dynamic. Article 1337 states it happens when a person takes improper advantage of their power over the will of another, depriving the latter of a reasonable freedom of choice.
Can you give me an example that doesn't involve the usual cult leader and follower trope? How does this actually happen in business?
Consider a situation where an elderly, ailing founder of a company is entirely dependent on their chief operating officer for their daily care and financial management. The COO isolates the founder from their family, controls their medication, and subtly but relentlessly pressures the founder into signing over majority voting rights for a fraction of their value, constantly reminding the founder, without me, you'd be in a nursing home.
There's no threat of a burning building. The weapon is the relationship itself, the dependency.
Precisely. The law looks at confidential, family, spiritual, and other relations between the parties to determine if that psychological hold effectively destroyed the person's free will.
Okay, that leaves F fraud. Articles 1338 to 1340. Our sources specifically highlight the term causal fraud, or dolo causante. What does that mean?
Fraud is a massive topic, but for contract formation, we are looking at insidious words or machinations used by one party to induce the other party to enter into the contract. Causal fraud means that without this deception, the party would never have agreed.
Give me a corporate scenario.
Suppose Company A is acquiring Company B. During due diligence, Company B presents 2 years of audited financial statements showing a 20% year-over-year profit margin. Based on those numbers, Company A agrees to a massive buyout price. 6 months later, Company A discovers that Company B was keeping a secret set of shadow books, and the profits were entirely fabricated through phantom sales.
Company B actively engineered a lie to secure my consent. That is causal fraud. The contract is voidable. But this raises a huge practical question about everyday business.
Sure.
I'm looking at the notes on fraud here, and I'm trying to reconcile it with standard marketing practices. Let's say I'm buying a fleet of delivery vans. The salesperson looks me in the eye and says, "These vans are the absolute pinnacle of human engineering. They will outlast your grandchildren, and driving them feels like floating on a cloud." I buy them. 6 months later, the transmission blows, and they certainly don't feel like a cloud. Is the law actually saying I've been defrauded? Can I annul the purchase?
This is a vital distinction in commercial law, and it saves the courts from drowning in frivolous lawsuits. The answer is found in Article 1340. The law states that the usual exaggerations in trade, what jurisprudence calls dealer's talk or puffery, are not in themselves fraudulent, provided the other party had an opportunity to know the facts.
Dealer's talk. So the law basically assumes that business people and consumers generally shouldn't be completely naive.
Exactly. The law protects you from hidden defects and active falsified data like those cooked accounting books. It does not protect you from subjective opinions, sales pitches, or standard marketing hyperbole. If a coffee shop claims to have the best coffee in the world, you cannot sue them for fraud when you discover you prefer a cafe in Italy.
Right.
You have a duty to exercise a modicum of common sense and skepticism. Caveat emptor buyer beware still plays a significant role when dealing with obvious exaggerations.
Okay, before we leave the massive topic of consent, we need to touch on the simulation of contracts. This is a scenario where the consent looks perfect on paper, but the parties are basically play acting. They put on a theatrical show for the outside world.
Yes. The contract is a facade, and there are 2 distinct types with very different legal outcomes: absolute simulation and relative simulation.
Absolute simulation means there is absolutely no intention to be bound whatsoever. The classic example, I owe millions to my suppliers, and I know they are about to file a lawsuit to seize my luxury vacation home. So I draft a deed of sale transferring the home to my brother, we sign it, we notarize it.
Well,
But my brother never pays me a single peso. I keep the keys, I keep paying the property taxes, and I spend every weekend there.
in that scenario, the contract is void. It is an illusion. It produces absolutely no legal effect because the consent was entirely fictitious. The courts will pierce that facade immediately, declare the sale void, and allow your creditors to seize the house.
But what about relative simulation? How is that different?
Relative simulation is when the parties conceal their true agreement behind a fake public-facing agreement.
Give me a corporate example of that.
Let's say a parent corporation wants to inject capital into a struggling subsidiary. However, for complex tax reasons, or to avoid spooking investors, they don't want to publicly declare it as an equity investment or a donation. So they execute a highly publicized service contract where the parent company agrees to pay the subsidiary 10 million pesos for consulting services.
Okay.
But behind closed doors, both parties know no actual consulting will take place. The true intent is just a transfer of funds.
So the service contract is fake, but the intention to transfer the 10 million pesos is very real.
Correct. In a relative simulation, Article 1346 states that the parties are bound by their real agreement, provided that the real agreement is lawful and does not prejudice a third person. So the courts will disregard the fake service contract, but they will uphold the hidden agreement to transfer the funds, applying the proper tax laws to what the transaction actually was.
That is a brilliant transition. If we connect this to the bigger picture, consent is essentially the ignition switch. It's the mechanism of agreement. But an engine needs a vehicle. The minds have met, but the law demands they meet on something tangible. What exactly are the parties agreeing to exchange? That leads us to the second leg of our stool, the object. Articles 1347 to 1349.
Right. The object is the what of the contract. It is the subject matter. What are you giving? What are you doing? The object can be things, it can be rights, or it can be services.
But I can't just contract for anything in the universe. I can't sign a contract to sell you the concept of gravity. There are strict rules. Our sources list the requisites. The object must be within the commerce of man. transmissible, lawful, possible, and determinate or determinable. Let's unpack those.
Within the commerce of man means the object can legally be earned, appropriated, and traded by private individuals. You cannot make a contract to sell a public plaza, a national park, or a navigable river. Those belong to the public dominion.
Transmissible means it can be legally passed from one person to another. Some rights are strictly personal and inherent to you as an individual, like your right to vote, your right to run for public office, or your parental rights. You cannot sell those.
No, definitely not.
But what about standard commercial rights? If a client owes my firm $1,000,000, can I sell that debt, the right to collect that $1,000,000 to a third-party collection agency?
Absolutely. Rights can be the valid object of a contract, subject to the rules on transmissibility. What you just described is an assignment of credit, which is the lifeblood of the modern financial industry.
Next requisite, lawful. The object cannot be contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. So a contract to sell smuggled narcotics is void.
Right. And then there is possible. You cannot contract to do something physically or legally impossible. If a tech company signs a contract promising to deliver software that predicts the future with 100% accuracy, that contract fails because the object is scientifically and physically impossible.
That brings us to the final requirement for the object, determinate or determinable. The object has to be specific enough that we know what we are talking about. You can't just write a contract that says, Company A agrees to sell Company B some vehicles. Which vehicles? A fleet of delivery scooters, 5 armored bank trucks, a corporate jet. The object must be determinate as to its kind.
Right. It must be specific enough to be identifiable. But here's the nuance. It doesn't have to be perfectly pinpointed at the exact microsecond of signing, as long as it is determinable without the need for a new agreement between the parties.
Wait, walk me through that. How can something be determinable without us having to negotiate a new contract later?
This happens in commodities and agriculture all the time. Let's say we sign a contract where I agree to sell you all the raw sugarcane produced on my 50-hectare plantation in Tarlac during the upcoming October harvest at the prevailing global market price on the exact day of delivery.
Okay, right now, sitting here in April, we don't know exactly how many tons of sugarcane that will be. Weather happens, pests happen. Nor do we know the exact global market price in October.
Exactly. The object is not fully determinate today. However, it is determinable. The contract contains the mathematical formula and the objective parameters to figure it out later. We won't need to sit down at a table and negotiate a new contract in October. We simply look at the harvest yield, look at the market index, plug the numbers into our existing formula, and the object becomes fully determinate.
That perfectly sets up my next question. In that scenario, we are making a contract about sugarcane that is currently just dirt and seeds. Can you make a contract about something that literally does not exist yet? Can I sell next year's harvest? Can a mining company pre-sell the copper they haven't dug out of the mountain yet?
Yes, absolutely. The law recognizes the concept of emptio res baratae, the sale of an expected thing. Future things can be the valid object of a contract. The law understands that commerce must look forward. As long as the future thing has a potential existence, the seeds are planted, the mountain has copper veins, and it is determinable, it satisfies the object leg of the stool.
Okay, so we have the yes, the consent. We have the what, the object. We have 2 very sturdy legs of our stool securely fastened. But we are missing the final crucial piece of architecture. Why are we doing this? Why are we exchanging this object? This brings us to Section 4 of the Blueprint, requisite number 3, the cause, Articles 1350 to 1355. And I'm going to warn you right now, this is notoriously the most confusing trap for CPA candidates and lawyers alike.
It really is. Causa in Spanish civil law is the essential reason which moves the contracting parties to enter into the contract. It is the immediate, direct, proximate legal why.
To understand cause, our sources categorize contracts into 3 types: onerous, remuneratory, and gratuitous. Let's define them briefly.
An onerous contract involves an exchange of a thing or service. It implies mutual burdens. The cause for each party is the prestation or promise of a thing or service by the other. In a standard corporate buyout, the cause for the selling company is the buyer's cash. The cause for the buying company is the acquisition of the seller's shares.
Okay, a remuneratory contract is a reward for a past service, provided the service did not constitute a legally demandable debt. For instance, if your colleague voluntarily worked 80-hour weeks to help you save a failing project last year, and today, out of gratitude, you sign a legally binding contract to pay them a 500,000 peso bonus, The past service is the cause.
And a gratuitous or lucrative contract is based on pure liberality. It is a donation. The cause is simply the generosity and beneficence of the giver.
Okay, that seems highly logical and straightforward. So where's the massive board trap? Why do people fail this section?
What's fascinating here is the strict, unyielding, and highly philosophical legal distinction between cause and motive under Article 1351. In everyday conversational English, we use those words interchangeably. My cause for doing this, or my motive for doing this. But in the civil code, they inhabit entirely different universes.
Cause versus motive. We need to dissect this.
Cause is the objective, immediate, direct, legal reason you enter a contract. It is known to the other party, it is the same for every contract of the same type, and it is absolutely essential for the contract's validity. Motive is the purely personal, private, subjective, indirect reason. It is a psychological driver operating entirely inside your own head. It is generally unknown to the other party, and crucially, it is legally irrelevant to the validity of the contract.
I need a high-stakes scenario to see this in action. Let's imagine a massive real estate transaction. I have a wealthy developer. I sign a contract to buy a 10-hectare plot of commercial land from you for 1 billion pesos. The cause of the contract for me is obtaining the 10 hectares. The cause for you is getting my 1 billion pesos.
Correct. That is a standard onerous contract of sale. The cause is the exchange of the object for the price. It is perfectly lawful.
Now, here is where it gets dark. My private motive for buying that land is that I know my biggest corporate rival is secretly planning to build their new headquarters on the adjacent lot. My motive is to buy this 10-hectare plot, turn it into a toxic waste processing facility, and utterly destroy the value of my rival's new headquarters, driving them into bankruptcy.
Okay, wow.
My motive is malicious, anti-competitive, and bordering on unlawful harassment. If my rival discovers my motive and alerts you, the seller, does my illegal, malicious motive make my contract with you void? Can you cancel the sale because my private thoughts were evil?
No, this is the exact trap that catches everyone. An illegal cause voids a contract, but an illegal motive does not affect the validity of the contract whatsoever.
Wait, really? Even if I am doing it to destroy someone?
The law looks at the contract itself. The sale of land for cash is perfectly valid. You got the land, the seller got the 1 billion pesos. What you privately plan to do with it, your malicious motive, does not invalidate the legal exchange of the object for the price. Now, your rival might sue you later for torts or environmental violations or antitrust behavior when you actually build the toxic plant, but the contract of sale between you and the seller remains completely intact and valid.
Wow. So if a CPEL question says, Party A buys a fleet of speedboats from Party B to use in a smuggling ring, the contract of sale is perfectly valid because the cause boats for cash is lawful, even though the mode of smuggling is illegal.
Exactly. The only exception, and this is a very narrow exception, is if the motive is so intertwined with the cause that it essentially becomes the cause and is shared by both parties. But the general ironclad rule stands: a motive does not affect validity.
Okay, so if my evil internal motive doesn't break the contract, what does break the cause leg of our stool? Our sources list 3 specific defects of cause.
First, absence or unlawful cause. If there is no cause at all, or the cause itself violates the law, morals, or public policy, the contract produces no effect. It is void. For example, if I promise to pay you 5 million pesos if you agree to rig the city's public bidding process, the cause, the act of bid rigging, is fundamentally unlawful. The entire contract is void ab initio.
Second is falsity of cause. What if the contract states a cause, but it's a blatant lie? Let's go back to our relative simulation. The contract says I paid you 10 million for consulting services, but I actually didn't pay her for consulting. I paid it as a hidden donation.
Article 1353 states that falsity of cause renders the contract void unless it can be proven that it was founded upon another cause which is true and lawful. So the court will strike down the fake consulting cause, but if you can prove it was actually intended as a valid donation, the contract might survive and be enforced under that true cause, assuming all taxes for donations are paid.
The third defect of cause is lesion, or inadequacy of cause. This is a huge issue for business owners. Let's say Company A is facing an immediate liquidity crisis. They are desperate for cash to make payroll. So they sell a prime piece of commercial real estate valued at 100 million pesos to Company B for only 20 million pesos. 6 months later, Company A survives the crisis, looks at the market, and realizes they took a catastrophic 80 million peso loss. Does paying way too much or selling for way too little invalidate a contract?
The legal philosophy here is brutal, but necessary for a free market. The law is very clear on this in Article 1355. Inadequacy of cause does not invalidate a contract. The law does not protect you from making a bad bargain, acting out of desperation, or just being terrible at math.
So Company A can't just cry unfair, run to a judge, and get their property back.
Absolutely not. If courts could undo every bad business deal just because someone lost money, the entire economy would grind to a halt. However, there is a crucial exception. Inadequacy of cause will invalidate the contract, i.e. if there's been fraud, mistake, or undue influence.
So we circle back to the vices of consent.
Exactly. If Company A sold it for $20 million because Company B's CEO threatened to expose a damaging corporate secret intimidation, or because Company B produced forged geological surveys claiming the land was unstable fraud, then the contract can be attacked. But absent those vices of consent, a terrible, desperate deal is just a bad deal. It remains entirely valid.
Okay. We have just spent an immense amount of time deep diving into the psychological and structural mechanics of consent, object, and cause. We've examined the three legs of the stool, but how does a CPA candidate or a corporate lawyer or a CEO actually deploy this knowledge in the real world?
This brings us to the grand synthesis, what the RFBT syllabus calls the defective contracts matrix. This is where all the disparate puzzle pieces we've discussed lock together into a cohesive diagnostic tool. When you look at a contract dispute, whether it's a board exam question or a real-world merger gone wrong, you aren't just looking at random rules. You're using COC as an X-ray to place the contract into one of four specific, legally actionable buckets.
The four classifications of defective contracts: void, voidable, unenforceable, and rescissible. Let's map these out using everything we've learned, and let's use our corrupted computer file analogy to visualize them. Bucket number 1, void contracts.
This is the absolute most severe defect. A void contract is a ghost. If consent, object, or cause is entirely missing, for example, it's an absolute simulation, so the consent is a complete fiction, the contract is void. Or if the object or cause is actively illegal, like our bid rigging scenario, it is void.
If an unenforceable contract is a corrupted file, a void contract is a file that was simply never saved to the hard drive in the first place. It doesn't exist. It produces absolutely no legal effect. It cannot be ratified or fixed later. And critically for the exams, the action or defense for the declaration of the inexistence of a contract does not prescribe. It is imprescriptible.
That is a vital point. You can challenge a void contract 50 years from now. If your grandfather signed a deed of sale for a public part, an object outside the commerce of man, that contract is as void today as it was the day he signed it.
Okay, bucket number 2, voidable contracts. How do we diagnose this using our X-ray?
In a voidable contract, all three legs of the stool are technically present. They're IS consent, they're IS an object, they're IS a cause. The file is saved on the hard drive and you can open it. However, the consent leg has a deep crack in it. It is inherently defective.
This is where we see the vices of consent. The consent exists, but it was given by someone relatively incapacitated, like our 16-year-old coding prodigy. Or it was vitiated by VIMFU, violence, intimidation, mistake, fraud, or undue influence.
Precisely. Let me throw a rapid-fire practical question back at you to test this. You are a CEO. You are sitting in a boardroom. Your rival puts a loaded gun on the table, points it at you, and says, "Sign this merger agreement transferring your company to me or I pull the trigger." You sign it. You didn't want to, but to save your life, you signed. Is that contract void because obviously your free will was completely suppressed, or is it voidable?
Based on the strict architecture we just built, it is voidable.
Explain why. Why doesn't a gun to the head instantly make it a ghost, a void contract?
This is the most counterintuitive yet perfectly logical nuance in the law. Consent was given. My mind evaluated the situation, die, or sign the paper. I chose to sign the paper. The consent exists on the document, but it is deeply vitiated by intimidation and violence. The law makes it voidable, which means the contract is perfectly valid and binding until I survive the encounter, go to the police, and then go to court to actively annul it.
Exactly. A gun to the head doesn't erase the contract automatically by operation of law. You, the victim, must actively wield the shield the law provides. You must seek annulment. If you do nothing, if you decide, for whatever bizarre reason, that you actually like the merger later on, the contract technically remains binding.
And unlike void contracts, which are imprescriptible, voidable contracts have a ticking clock, right?
Yes. The action for annulment prescribes in exactly 4 years. If you were intimidated, the 4-year countdown starts from the exact moment the intimidation ceases. If you don't file a lawsuit within those 4 years, the crack in the leg seals up and the contract becomes permanently valid.
Okay, bucket number 3, unenforceable contracts. We touched on this with the two 16-year-olds.
Yes. The corrupted file. This happens when both parties are incapacitated to give consent, but it also happens in another major scenario when a contract violates the statute of frauds.
The statute of frauds. This is the law that dictates that certain high-stakes agreements, like a lease of real estate for more than a year, or a sale of goods over a certain monetary threshold, must be put into writing to be enforceable.
Correct. If you and I verbally agree to sell a commercial building for 50 million pesos and we shake hands on it, we have consent, object, and cause. But because it violates the statute of frauds by remaining oral, it is unenforceable. The court will just look at us and say, I cannot process this oral data. But if we sit down the next day and write it out on a napkin and sign it, we have ratified it. We updated the software, and the contract is now perfectly enforceable.
And finally, bucket number 4, resciscible contracts. This one is entirely unique. It breaks the pattern.
It does. In a resciscible contract, the COC X-ray comes back perfectly healthy. All essential elements are valid. Consent is totally free of vices. The object is lawful. The cause is lawful.
So if the stool has 3 solid legs, why is it in the defective contracts matrix?
Because of the collateral damage it causes. A resciscible contract is defective because the execution of the contract causes an unfair economic lesion or profound financial damage to one of the parties, or more commonly, to a third person who wasn't even at the signing table.
Give me a corporate example of a resciscible contract.
The absolute most common example in the RFBT exam is a contract entered into in fraud of creditors. Let's say your logistics corporation owes a banking syndicate 500 million pesos. You know the bank is preparing to file a lawsuit to seize your only remaining major asset, a massive shipping dock. So to hide the asset, you hastily sell that dock to your brother-in-law's corporation for a completely fair market price.
Okay, let's x-ray that sale. My consent was real. His consent was real. The dock is lawful. The cash exchange is lawful. It's not a simulation. He actually paid me the money. The contract between me and my brother-in-law is technically perfect.
It is perfect, but it severely prejudices the banking syndicate a third person. You intentionally removed an asset from your estate that the bank had a right to pursue.
So what can the bank do? They aren't a party to the contract.
The law grants the bank a special remedy called an action for rescission. They can petition the court to effectively undo the valid contract between you and your brother-in-law up to the extent necessary to cover their 500 million peso debt because the contract was designed to damage them.
So rescission is an equitable remedy for collateral damage.
Precisely. And just like voidable contracts, the action for rescission generally prescribes in 4 years from the time the injured party discovers the fraudulent contract.
This matrix is incredible. When you lay it out like this, understanding the law isn't just about passing a multiple-choice CPA exam. It literally gives you X-ray vision. When you look at an M&A deal, an employment offer, a commercial lease, or a supplier agreement, you don't just see a stack of paper anymore. You see the 3 legs of the stool. You look for the COC. You ask yourself, is the consent truly free? Or is there an undercurrent of undue influence? Is the object within the commerce of man? Is the cause lawful? Or is it a hidden simulation? And if you spot a defect, you immediately know which of the 4 buckets it falls into, who has the power to sue, and exactly how much time is on the clock.
That is exactly the goal of this analytical framework. The Civil Code is not just a list of prohibitions to memorize. It is the fundamental operating system for all commercial human interaction.
As we wrap up this incredibly deep dive, let's summarize the absolute core of what we've unpacked today. The foundation of Philippine contract law rests entirely on the 3-legged stool of Article 1318. You must have consent, which demands a true psychological meeting of minds through a certain offer and an absolute acceptance, subject to the cognition theory. You must have an object, which is the lawful, possible, and determinable subject matter. And you must have a cause, the objective, immediate legal reason for the obligation, which is strictly separated from your private subjective motives.
And if I may add a final philosophical thought from the legal perspective, once those 3 elements are present, Article 1315 of the Civil Code kicks in. It states that contracts are perfected by mere consent. But from that moment of perfection, the parties are bound not only to the fulfillment of what has been expressly stipulated on the paper, but also to all the consequences which, according to their nature, may be in keeping with good faith, usage, and law. You aren't just bound by the ink, you are bound by the invisible ethical rules of good faith that govern all human dealings. The law expects you to act honorably.
That is a remarkably powerful thought, and leads me to something I want to leave you, our listener, pondering today. We've spent all this time exploring the rigid, meticulous requirements the law demands for a meeting of the minds in a business setting. The capacity, the absolute acceptance, the lawful cause. But step outside the corporate boardroom for a second and think about all the unspoken social contracts you navigate every single day with your coworkers, your family, your friends. If we applied the rigorous X-ray of the civil code to our personal lives, how many of our everyday relationships are operating on voidable consent because of subtle intimidation or emotional undue influence? How many of our personal agreements have completely different hidden motives driving them behind the stated cause?
That is a very unsettling but profoundly fascinating question to consider.
Keep that in mind the next time you simply agree to something. The architecture of a contract isn't just dry law. It is human psychology, power dynamics, and vulnerability codified into rules. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the law on contracts. Keep exploring, keep questioning the invisible scaffolding of the world around you, and we'll see you next time.